All right, welcome everybody back to the C Show. I'm Chris, your host, and we are here today with author and historian Mike Klinger, and he is going to tell us some insights about a few battles and campaigns and some observations that some of us have never heard before. He wants to start off telling us about the Spring Hill campaign. That's actually something I'm not too familiar with, Mike. So, why don't you jump in and tell me a little bit about that?
Um, well, I'm going to start with, I've made some observations that I don't seem to read anywhere else, and I just thought I'd throw it out there for discussion. When Schofield's Union Army retreated to the Duck River at Columbia, Hood pulled up on the south side of the Duck River and started his flanking movement to move to Spring Hill. When he did that, to make the Yankees think that he was still in position, he left Lee's entire corps of infantry south of the Duck, and also the great majority of his artillery. Hood then crossed the Duck River to the east of Columbia.
Yeah.
And what I think is strange is that he then decided to march all the way to Spring Hill to cut the road. And what happened was he underestimated the length of time that it would take for his force to march that distance, and as a consequence, he ran out of daylight.
This is on the road to Franklin.
This is at Spring Hill.
Spring Hill, okay.
So Schofield actually thought that what Hood would do was, once he got across the river, was just turn west and hit the Union line in the flank. And had he done that, all of his artillery on the south side of the Duck and Lee's corps of infantry could have fired across the Duck River in support of Hood's attack on the east end of the Union line.
So he would have been firing right into him.
Yeah, and had the
like
Union,
firing right into the flank.
Yes, and had the Union managed to establish a north-south defensive line to meet Hood's artillery on the south side of the river would have enfilade any north-south line the Yankees tried to form. So that's one thing. I'm a little surprised that he marched all the way to Spring Hill.
So he could have destroyed that army right there?
Well, they could have damaged it pretty badly. I think by that time of the war, both armies were pretty much panic-proof. And the Union Army may have been driven west. I don't think that they would have necessarily been destroyed, but I do think they could have been damaged a lot, and certainly more than they were damaged at Spring Hill.
Do you think that he could have damaged them enough to make a difference in the campaign? I mean, throughout the rest of Tennessee?
Probably, because the butchery at Franklin wouldn't have happened.
Okay.
And because I think that the Federal Army would have been driven west of Franklin and had to approach Nashville from the west, and both armies would have then just been in a foot race. So Hood would have ended up with landing at Nashville with 7,500 troops that had not been killed or wounded at Franklin, and the 12 generals that he lost at Franklin. So to get back to Spring Hill, the problem was that when the Confederate Army marched into the Spring Hill, it was already turning dusk. And the gathering darkness made reconnoitering somewhat limited because they didn't have time. And Cheatham was ordered to move west and cut the pike. But as Cheatham was moving, he started drawing heavy infantry fire from Wagner's division that was at Spring Hill. And one thing that I don't think gets enough credit is, and it's overshadowed because of Wagner's follow-up the next day at Franklin, but Wagner put up a pretty good fight at Spring Hill. One division of infantry essentially fought Cheatham's Corps to a standstill, Stewart's Corps to a standstill, and Forrest Cavalry. So that ain't a bad day's work for one division of infantry. Now, they were aided, like I say, by the darkness, but it was a good day's fight for Wagner's division. Now, one of the things that always comes up with Spring Hill is the what-ifers always say, well, if they'd have just cut the road at Spring Hill, the Yankees would have been forced to surrender. And I think that's nonsense. I think for a couple of reasons. The force that Schofield was leading to the relief of Wagner was the 23rd Army Corps, which essentially is the Army of the Ohio.
Okay.
The Army of the Ohio had been used throughout the Atlanta campaign as flankers. As a matter of fact, the 23rd Army Corps either developed or went around the flank of the Confederate Army at Cassville, Burnt Hickory, Lost Mountain, Kennesaw, Utoy Creek. It was the 23rd Army Corps that forced the crossing of the Chattahoochee, and they cut the rail line at Rough and Ready. So they had
experienced group of men.
Well, they had some fame in the rest of the Army as flankers. And I have a friend named Mark Weldon, and Mark has a letter from a 104th Ohio guy in the 23rd Corps. When they got to North Carolina, they went in and took Fort Anderson on the Cape Fear River and then moved up to Wilmington. And when they finally hooked up with Sherman's forces coming up through South Carolina, they had, the 23rd Corps had been issued new uniforms, so they looked pretty presentable. And Sherman's guys came in all muddy and dirty and ragged and filthy, and they saw these guys standing there in new uniforms and thought that they were green troops and started giving them a hard time like veteran troops do to green troops. And they were surprised that they got it right back. And somebody finally yelled over, "Who are you guys?" And somebody in the 104th Ohio yelled back, 23rd Corps. And somebody in Sherman's army yelled back, "It's all right, boys, it's Sherman's flanking machine." So the rest of the army considered the 23rd Corps as Sherman's flanking machine. Now keep that in mind as they're pounding up the pike towards Spring Hill. Schofield was in the lead, and he had Ruger's 2nd Division of the 23rd Corps with him, followed immediately by the 3rd Corps, or 3rd Division. And as they came up the pike, they were already marching in battle formation. And one of the what ifs is they think that Bates could have been able to get across the road, the Spring Hill Pike. And he probably should have. However, had Bates got his division across the Spring Hill Pike, he would have been in line east to west, and his western flank would have been in the air. As the 23rd Corps marched up the pike, to their right, they could see all the Confederate campfires burning. To the left, there was darkness. In addition to that, the entire 4th Corps artillery park reserve was in Spring Hill. So if Bate would have got his division across the road, the 4th Corps artillery would have been at his back, and Sherman's flankers were marching right towards him in battle formation. To their right, they could see campfires. To the left, they could see darkness. I'm pretty sure I know which way those professional flankers would have gone. They'd have gone to the darkness. In addition to that,
is this when they passed by Sherman or by Hood's army in the middle of the night and they didn't know it?
Yes.
So they were counting within like feet of them.
Yeah. They, in addition to the fact that they'd have gone around, most of the 23rd Corps moved down to Columbia on the railroad line that ran through Spring Hill and was to the west of the Spring Hill Franklin Pike. So those guys had just come down that railroad, so they knew it was over there. And possibly they would have lost their trains, but possibly not, because a lot of the trains had already been moved to Spring Hill. And the Confederates proved that they could move infantry cross country there. So I see no reason why the Yankee infantry wouldn't have been able to move cross country to the west and flank Bate out of his position.
What are the numbers here, Confederate versus Yankee? What ballpark it? Can you?
The Confederates outnumbered the Yankees a bit. I've read accounts that the Confederates had about 35,000 men at Franklin, and the 4th Corps was much bigger than the 23rd Corps. The 23rd Corps probably had about 8,000 men, and the 4th Corps had about 15,000. So they were outnumbered somewhat, but they have also, and nobody takes this into consideration, they were on a 4-month-long winning streak. Their morale was not low. So had the Confederates cut them off, their morale was not such that they were going to lay down and roll over. I think that they were still pretty aggressive, and like I said earlier, the armies, the veteran armies of both sides were very nearly tank-proof at that time of the war. The common infantrymen knew how to fight, and they knew what they could do and what they couldn't do. So we had Bate on the south side, and Bate did something very odd. He had moved his Confederate division up literally within 50 yards of the Columbia Franklin Pike. And he was ordered to move north and join Stevens. And instead of him moving to the pike and marching his troops up the pike to get to Stevens' left, he marched them across country. had he just moved out to the road, he might have been in the way when the Yankees got there. But he did not do that. He marched his troops cross country, and they were literally so close. I have an account of a lieutenant in Granbury's brigade who said the Yankee infantry was moving so close that they could hear the swish of the grass as the infantrymen moved through it. So they were close. And then to the north of Spring Hill, Stewart was forced to cut the road. He also failed. But once again, his western flank would have been in the air. And Forrest was supposed to cut the road, and his western flank would have been in the air. Now, in Forrest's case, he was very nearly out of ammunition. He'd been sparring with Wilson's cavalry all the way from the Duck River to Spring Hill, and his troopers were low on ammunition. But I believe that all this what-if stuff about them cutting the road at Spring Hill and destroying the Union Army is very heavily overrated. Now, the other thing that happened is, and people want to blame Hood, they want to blame Stephen, I think the entire Confederate command system broke down. And it breaks down so simply that the Confederate Army went to sleep at Franklin, or at Spring Hill. They laid down and went to sleep, and everyone from the Union private to the Union generals kept on their feet and kept marching. And that's all that Spring Hill comes down to. The Yankees kept marching, the Confederates went to bed. And Schofield took Ruger's division, pushed on up to Rutherford Creek, and Thompson Station. And at Thompson Station, they went into defensive formation to the east of Thompson Station. It was a crossroad as well. And the 2nd Brigade of the 2nd Division held that crossroad until the rest of the 23rd Corps marched past it. The rest of the 4th Corps followed behind the 23rd Corps, and as they all made it out of town, they also drove the Schofield supply train with them. And it's estimated that Schofield had between 800 and 1,000 wagons. And that left Wagner's men the rear guard again. And they pulled out before daylight and started moving north. Forrest went after them, and there was all kinds of discriminations in the Confederate High Command that the Yankees had escaped overnight. And Forrest kind of pressed Wagner a bit, but they delayed it long enough. They finally got back to the Winstead Hill, and the gap between Winstead Hill and Breezy Hill, just south of Franklin. And there he went into formation where he stacked his brigade 3 deep. And as the southernmost brigade was pressed, it would fall back to the next brigade behind them, who had already dug in. And they continued that all the way back to Franklin. They were hurried a little bit because Forrest was flanking them to their right on another road, but they were able to delay Hood long enough that once again they burnt all of Hood's daylight. And they came up to Franklin, and Hood decided to attack. I think a lot of people give Hood a hard time for actually attacking at Franklin, but Hood knew that if Schofield united with Thomas in Nashville, that there was no way that he could defeat the combined armies of Schofield and Thomas.
But Hood had no artillery support at Franklin, right?
They had some, but not very much.
Okay.
A couple batteries. And the thing was, had Hood punched a permanent hole in the center of the Union line, he had the Federals at a severe disadvantage. They had their backs to a river, and a breakthrough there might have destroyed the Union Army because they couldn't have gotten away. However, because of the gathering darkness, once again, I think Hood's greatest failure at Franklin was not that he attacked, but that he did not have time to deploy properly. On the right, between the railroad and the Columbia-Franklin Pike, he stacked up several divisions there. The problem was that front narrowed as they went forward. So the brigades started stacking up and interfering with each other. And they ran into an absolute buzzsaw because many of Casement's Federal brigades were armed with repeating rifles.
I've heard that.
And they, one Confederate officer said, never before in the history of warfare had so few killed so many in so short a time. They had, the Federals had also constructed a beta out of an Osage orange head, which is thorny, and it's real fibrous. The British used to make their longbows out of Osage orange because it was such tough, fibrous wood. So it was difficult to break off. It was difficult to cut your way through. And when they got up into the abatis, they were just in a killing zone for the repeating rifle. And then the second big thing that happened to the center went in actually with Claiborne's division and the right of Brown's division. And Wagner had fouled up, and he left two brigades out in front of the Franklin breastwork. And Oakdyke, the 3rd Brigade commander, came riding up, and Oakdyke told him to go into position there. And supposedly, Oakdyke said the only thing that troops in front of the breastworks are good for is to help the enemy. And he refused to go into position, and he led his brigade up, and they went into position on the northern slope of the Carter House Hill. But the other two,
is that the house that had all the bullet holes in it?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's where they had all the Confederate generals' bodies laid out.
No, actually, they were laid out at the. There were several of them laid out at. I can't think of the name of the house, but it's a house that was turned into a Confederate hospital. And
Dan Korn, who's been on here with a few times, he said there was like I think he said he was in it, and at one time he stopped counting, and he counted 100 bullet holes in the house.
Well, they have a wooden office building on the south side of the house, and I'll bet you there's closer to 1,000 in that little office building, and it's probably 20 by 15. And right next to that is a wooden smokehouse with about a 5-foot gap between them, and it also is covered. But interestingly enough, on the smokehouse, the north-south facing edge of the smokehouse, you can see where the ricochets hit because the lead was ground into the brick, and there are little white streaks of lead on the red brick. So you can actually tell that it's a ricochet. But the end of the house was so badly shot up that it was re-bricked at some time, which is unfortunate. But the woodwork in the house is all, there are bullet holes and everything. But,
So I'm thinking, sorry, I was just thinking about that charge at Franklin and how just a slaughter it is, and some of the officers arguing at Hood, and I'm thinking, there's General Hood standing in front of you that's missing a leg up at the hip, an arm that's useless. How do you tell this man no or question his bravery when he's?
Yeah, one thing I would like to make clear, and the very first magazine article I ever wrote was on Franklin, and I made the same error that a lot of others made, because I trusted a lot of the old historians, and there was claims that Hood was using laudanum and alcohol for all the pain he was in. And I wrote that, and I was wrong. Since then, they found all of Hood's papers in a trunk in a descendant attic, and among the papers was Hood's surgeon's medical record for when Hood was wounded. And they gave Hood laudanum once, and only once. Hood was not high on laudanum at Franklin or Spring.
I've heard several people come back and say that now that sometimes that they've read over his records that Hood was not under the influence of drugs, and Hood probably still would have made that same decision, if he was a whole man. I just can't help but wonder how much he was affected psychologically by losing, that much of him. That has to have effect on somebody psychologically.
That and losing Atlanta. I mean,
yeah, and from what I've read too, and about, because Hood's always been one of my favorite generals, and for the longest time, I felt like, well, I've heard what all the historians said. Once he became the Army commander, he was horrible, the worst commander. And then I started reading about what the situation he was put in, and it was like Hood was almost put in a no-win situation. And then I started studying some of the battles, and it was like, dang, he was so close to, a few more minutes of daylight here, or, if he would have got there a little bit quicker, Hood would have won the majority of those battles. I mean, it seemed like it was just luck just was not on his side on a lot of them.
I think a lot of them, he had the same problem. He thought his troops could move farther than they could in a given amount of time. But the first Battle of Atlanta, he actually used Johnson's plan. And but the reality is, anybody that was entrenched could really do an incredible amount of damage to any attacking force. particularly when they were veterans and well-entrenched veterans. And this was shown over and over again throughout the latter Civil War. The infantrymen knew that you didn't stand much chance against attacking trenches, but the officers didn't get it quite as quick. Also, I think, interestingly enough, I think the Western troops learned to dig before the Eastern troops did. I think by 1863, a lot of the Western troops were already digging trenches when they stopped for the night. And the book that I'm writing, the regimental history that I wrote.
You can tell us about that book now. You wrote a book called what now?
I wrote a book on the 118th Ohio, and I found 500 pages of unpublished letters and 6 diaries.
Where did you find those at?
Oh man, I looked everywhere. I found a lot of them in the county museums where the regiment was raised. I found them at Carlisle Military History Institute. I found them at the Ohio Historical Center in Columbus.
Now, why this regiment? Did you have family in it?
Yes, actually, I started out thinking I had 3 in it, and by the time I got to the end of the book, I found out I had 5, because 2 of the men came home and married the Klinger boy's aunt.
I'll tell you, let me catch you. I'll tell you something real quick. Right there's a funny story. I was looking at, I think I forgot what the population exactly was in 1861 here in Alabama, but that when they drew their regiments, they would draw them from around 4 counties. Well, one of the regiments that was drawn, where I lived, where my grandparents lived, there was a regiment that was drawn through 4 counties, and so I was looking at the rosters and those names, and the roster was filled with the names of Peaks, Bice, Youngblood, and Yarber, and that was my father's name, my mother's maiden name, my grandmother's maiden name, and my another maiden name over there. So my whole family was full of that roster, and I think that many family members on one side or in one unit there.
What regiment was your folks in?
You know, I want to say again, because I started researching this a while back and lost track of it. I was going to say it was the 48th regiment, because I've got it written down, but I went through it and I found the names in several other units around there, and there was one man that I got lost sidetracked, and I've got to go back in and start studying it. But this just shows you how, it seems like the war was so long ago, but in reality, it was only a couple generations ago. My grandfather was born in 1930, and his father was born in 1870. My great grandfather was born in 1870, and there was a man named I forgot what his name was, but my great grandfather's name was John. But this man settled in Walker County, where he was born, and he was the only Peaks that settled there. And he would have been about 28 when my great grandfather was born. So that's got to be his father. I just got to finish putting 2 and 2 together with that.
My one whole company of this 118th Ohio enlisted in Delphus, Ohio, where I grew up. And Delphus is an odd little town. It's got 8,000 people in it. It's in 3 counties. But an odd thing about it is my youngest son married a girl from Columbia City, or from Churubusco, Indiana. So from Churubusco, Indiana. And when we started tracing her Civil War ancestors, she had an ancestor in 118. My grandsons have ancestors from both sides of the same regiment. It's just kind of, yeah.
Well, I need to get in touch with one of my it should be my great aunt, because my grandmother was the youngest one. I had a great aunt that died. Well, God, she'd be 102 now, but she's got daughters up in 80. And somebody was telling me the story, but I didn't get to hear it. But she was talking about, it was either her grandfather. He was killed, I think, in the Atlanta campaign. I need to get in touch with her because she would probably know some more about this too. Because I mean, it can't be that hard for me to track back here. I mean, because a lot of these people just a couple generations. Like I said, she's 85 years old. It was just a couple generations away, and she was talking about when he got killed.
My granddad dad got killed when he was young, and his grandpa raised him, and his grandpa was Dan Klinger in the 118th Ohio. And he told me that he would never talk about the war at all. But he said on Sundays, the old men would come to the parlor and sit in the parlor and smoke cigars and drink whiskey. And he said he was always real curious about what they talked about. He was just a little kid. And he crawled under the table and hid under the tablecloth and was just sitting under there. And the only story he had from his great-grandfather is they were talking about two men in the regiment got in a fight over the water where a horse had stepped in the mud. And the footprint had filled with water, and one of the men knifed the other into the water. And he said that just at that moment, one of the other old men says, "There's a damn kid under this table," and gave him a boot, and they threw him out of the room. He said, "It's the only story I got." but we have, Jake and I have done some research, and we've got like, how many ancestors we're up to?
Yeah, he was telling me some stuff to do to start looking it up and researching it.
We have, I'll help them out, please. We have like, he wants to look up some things. So we have like 15 to 20 Civil War ancestors. Oh, Jake just said 22. Mine's got 27. And all from about the same three counties. So
all three counties.
Home.
Yeah. Huh.
27, and from all over West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa. But to get back to Franklin, when Wagner left those two brigades out front, the Confederates realized right away that he had screwed up. And so did the two brigades. Officers kept going back to Wagner, who was sitting back at the Carter House and saying, "The whole Confederate Army's coming." And Wagner was just sitting there saying, "Doesn't matter, fight them." Well, those two Yankee brigades got hit by 18 Confederate brigades who went on either side of them and right over them. And Cox later wrote that the problem with those two brigades out front was that they had an excess of courage. They stayed longer than they should have. And actually, the men knew that that somebody had made a mistake and kept yelling to their officers to get them out of there. And the officers wouldn't pull back. So when they finally got overran, the Federal brigades took off running for the main work, and the Confederates said go in with them because they knew that the main work could not fire because of fear of hitting the Yankees from Wagner's 2 brigades. So what happened is they hit the Union line on both sides of the Columbia Franklin Pike from the Cotton Gin, and the Cotton Gin is an odd salient here. From the Cotton Gin, the line angles back at about a 45-degree angle all the way back to the Carter House. And so the Confederates broke that loose, but the 23rd Corps had several reserve regiments. They had the 8th Tennessee and 2 Kentucky regiments that were in reserve right behind the Cotton Gin. And in addition to that was the 175th Ohio, which was basically a brand new regiment. And it's probably closer to 1,000 men than not. And so it was probably about the size of a regular federal brigade. And it came charging forward, and they recaptured all of the line back up to the Cotton Gin. But and then on the other side of the pike, Oakdyke's brigade went forward, and there were 2 reserve Green regiments there as well, the 183rd Ohio and the 44th Missouri, and they were both nearly 1,000 men. And the guys who ripped loose from the first line fell back onto the line from the 44th Missouri and the 183rd Ohio, and Oakdyke's men came up to it, and soon they had Yankee soldiers five deep, and the front guy was firing, and everybody else was loading and passing him up their rifles. So they were able to keep up an absolutely murderous, almost continuous fire. But when the Yankees recaptured the salient at the Cotton Gin, they were also able to fire into the Confederate eastern flank. Everybody that had broken through was suddenly in a 2-way crossfire. And one of the observations that I've made is that I think there was a salient to the west of them too. If you look at a lot of maps of the Union line at Franklin, they draw a straight line from the Carter Creek Pike over to the Columbia Franklin Pike. And these guys were veterans of trench warfare, and there's no way that they'd have dug a straight trench. The 118th Ohio alone dug 36 trenches in the Atlantic campaign.
Wow.
And the Carter House has an older map that I have found, and instead of it being a straight line, it's an angled line. And I have a photo, a map of it here. You can see that it's a curve, and that red circle that I drew on there is from the 118th Ohio, who carried Enfield, 577 Enfield. Accurate range is 400 yards, but they would kill at several hundred yards beyond that. And just the 118th enfiladed 7 different Confederate brigades that went across their front. But every one of these regiments in here could do the same. So the Confederates were in a horrible crossfire on the on their western flank, and all of the fire that went beyond the 400 range went into Brown's division over here and killed a lot of the men up against the breastwork. Now, that being said, after the second volley, there was no more aimed shooting because the smoke laid so thick on the battlefield that you couldn't see. However, what you could see was the two different lines of infantry firing because you could see the fire from the ends of the muskets of both lines. And so the 118th and all the rest of the brigades in Moore's division would have been able to fire into any Confederate line that they could see shooting. And at the end of the battle, after dark, they sent Lee's divisions in, and they also went in on the western part of the center of the Union line. But some genius decided so that they could maintain formation, they put a man with a torch on either end of the line, and all the Yankees did was shoot between the torches. But this traverse here that I have marked in red, that the 118th is in, that's not on the map. However, it is mentioned by the colonel of the 118th, whose entire report on the Battle of Franklin was about 3 sentences. And he said, because we were in a traverse, we were able, and the enemy attacked across our front, and we were able to do great damage. And that's all he wrote about Franklin. But the 5,000 men of Ruger's division of the 23rd Corps fired about 100 rounds a man. The 118th Ohio voted for president just before Franklin, and 170 men voted. And I figure almost everybody probably voted. So if you figure that out, they put out 17,000 rounds out across the battlefield. And a lot of it was suppressive fire and not aimed. But it doesn't matter if it's aimed, if it hits you. I don't think that the right center of the Union line gets enough attention. Everybody knows about the traverse by the cotton gin, but nobody knows about this one on the western flank. And across the Carter Creek Pike is the 4th Corps division, and one of the Confederate cavalry brigades made one attack and got and received one volley and then didn't attack again. But the 80th Indiana, that was right next to the 118th Ohio, said that they counted 14 separate assaults against their line.
God.
So there was some pretty vicious fighting through there. And a gentleman by the name of Knight wrote a book on the Battle of Franklin. And he made some interesting comparisons. In the 4 hours fight at Franklin, it probably had about 3,500 men engaged total. There were 10,000 casualties combined in 4 hours. At D-Day in Normandy, we landed 155,000 troops, and in 24 hours of combat, fighting Germans with three-sided artillery and automatic weapons, the Germans inflicted 10,000 casualties on 155,000. We did it to each other in 4 hours with mainly muzzle-loading weapons at Franklin. That's how vicious it was. And he also pointed out that an American soldier landing on Omaha Beach at Normandy had a 3 times better chance of surviving unhit than a Confederate soldier that charged the Franklin. And I think that's astounding. In the Pacific, at the Battle of Peleliu Island was considered our bloodiest island fight, and the U.S. Army lost about 11,000 men, and that was over a month. And once again, there was 10,000 men went down at Franklin in 4 hours.
God.
So the amount of, and you know, very seldom in the Civil War was there much bayonet fighting, but there was at Franklin. And for the 20 minutes around the Carter House, it was almost all hand-to-hand fighting. And Isaac Sherwood, who was the colonel of the 111th Ohio, and he wrote a history of the 111th. He gets a little exaggerated sometimes, but he wrote about a friend of his who was colonel of the 50th Ohio, and the colonel told him that a bald-headed Confederate jumped up on the breastwork right next to the pike and buried an axe in the head of one of his boys, and the colonel shot him dead with a revolver. But after the battle, the colonel had 2 bayonet holes thrust in his clothes that didn't hit him. So it was pretty close. An officer in the 72nd Ohio, or 72nd Illinois, I'm sorry, he wrote that he fired his revolver 9 times during the fight and never more than 20 yards apart.
God.
So, never more than 20 foot, I'm sorry, away. So, it was pretty intense. It was pretty close. But the big thing I want to stress is that that crossfire coming from the Union right center. And I think that did a lot more damage than it gets credit for. And you know, there's a famous tragic occurrence at Franklin. Todd Carter was the son of the Carter family, who Carter House Hill, and he led his. He went into the attack with his unit, and they said, "Most home, boys." And that night, after the Yankees retreated, an officer went to that Carter House and he said, "Your son's lying wounded on the battlefield." And they went out and found him, and he'd been hit like 6 or 7 times. One of them dead, and they literally carried him back to his family home, and he died and was dead. But he was in this area that was in that crossfire from the right side of Morse Brigade. And I started talking earlier about deployment, and I said they overloaded the right. It makes you wonder if those brigades of Brown and Claiborne's divisions that hit the center, if the reserve regiment of the 23rd Corps and the and Oak Dyke coming up would have been enough had they moved another division in behind them. The division that actually hit the center was weaker than the Confederate attack on the right. And if they'd have punched through there, they'd have been right down to the river, and they would have controlled the bridges, and the Yankees would have been back. So it was a close run thing, and had it succeeded, Hood would be a hero now. Everybody wants to badmouth him for that attack, but it was a very close run thing. And I think that I read a thing one time that said the Confederate charge at Franklin. I think this was written by an English historian, but it said the Confederate charge at Franklin is the greatest charge in American military history. And I believe he was probably correct. However, that means that the defense that stopped it cold had to be pretty good. And in the end, 22 Confederate brigades attacked 5 23rd Corps brigades and 3 4th Corps brigades, and 2 of the 4th Corps brigades were broken early. Conrad's and Lane's that left out front. So in the end, most of the fighting in Franklin was done by 6 brigades, and those 6 brigades stopped 22 Confederate brigades.
Wow.
There was unlimited valor on both sides.
That I couldn't imagine. I mean, Franklin. That just. Until I started this group, I've always been an Eastern theater guy myself, but I've learned so much more about the Western theater. Had a greater appreciation for it now, especially some of the stuff that I didn't know. I really never studied the Battle of Franklin. Now, before we close, tell me what other books you was writing.
I'm writing the history of the Army of the Ohio, the Second Army of the Ohio, from 1863 to 1865. Oddly enough, in the Atlanta campaign, there were 4 armies that were involved. For the Union, there was the Army of the Ohio, the Army of the Tennessee, and the Army of the Cumberland. The Army of the Cumberland was 4 times bigger than the Army of the Ohio. And for the South, the Army of Tennessee. All of them have had a history written about them, except for the Army of the Ohio. And I just finished the first day at Nashville last week, so I'm coming on with that book pretty well here. But I think that's one of the reasons that nobody knows what their strength was, their flanking strength. And so you get stuff like Spring Hill, and nobody knows what these guys had done. I've had people tell me the 23rd Corps never did any fighting in the Atlanta campaign. Well, they did. This 118th Ohio Regiment at Resaca, we were ordered to charge with 270 men, and they lost 116 of them in 10 minutes. To be fair, they were probably ordered in by a drunken general who was relieved of command, but this guy did some real screw up. When they told him to attack at Resaca, he literally charged over some brigades that were on his right, broke them up, and he failed to get his artillery into position to support the attack. So he made some dramatic blunders. And Schofield makes a big deal out of it in his book, 46 Years in the Army, that he relieved him because of his incompetence. But the reality is, all they did was relieve him from combat command. He was eventually just shifted sideways, and he ended up commanding a post. So he never took any penalty for his disaster that he created at Osaka, and his division ended up losing about 700 men. But he was never really penalized. Oddly enough, he died in 1866, and his grave was desecrated annually for years after he died. So somebody never forgave him.
And when do you expect to have this book out?
Well, the first one, the 118th, that's the publishers now, and to be honest, I'm a little irritated with them that it's not out now. But I'm figuring maybe a couple months for it, and then I got to do all of the maps and illustration kit for the Army of the Ohio book yet, so probably another couple months on it before it goes to the publisher. So hopefully I can get the one out. I'm hoping to have the one out in time to go to the Franklin, Tennessee Civil War show and possibly set up a table. But there's a huge show in Ohio, Mansfield, Civil War show, and I was hoping to be able to set up there, but that's the first weekend of May, and they're not going to have it ready. That's a great show, though.
Found me some interesting stuff here today. Is there anything you want to add to our show before we close it out today, or?
I think that one thing about the Western troops compared to the Army of the Potomac troops, I think the Western Federal troops are much more like the Confederate Western troops than they were the Army of the Potomac. I think that they came from the same sorts of backgrounds. The great majority of them were farmers. And many of them grew up with a rifle in their hand hunting. I think that I find the Western troops interesting because they fought differently.
I've heard some other people say that too. They believe that that I've heard that.
I just discovered what the 23rd Corps did at the first day of Nashville. It was confusing to try to research. And I finally found out why. Woodford was replaced by General Couch at Nashville. And Couch was the Army of the Potomac general. And when he ordered his division to get into line, well, they didn't do straight lines and people collar soldiering like the Army of the Potomac. They just kind of gathered together then, and it irritated him. And he started trying to shuffle them around to try to get them in some kind of a straight formation. And a guy in the 112th Illinois just said all he did was shift us into a huge mob. And they were standing there, and a Confederate artillery chief opened on him. And the division, without any orders, started. And they went up the hill and they hit Ector's Texas Brigade. They captured the guns that were shooting at them. Ector's Texas Brigade took off and went to the next hill. They gathered themselves together, and the colonel of the 107th Illinois said, "Let's go, boys." And they went and took the second hill. And during all this, Couch was appalled that these guys were just charging in a mob, and he actually sent orders to Sherwood and said, "Get your men in a line." And Sherwood sent back a note said, "I'll come to your headquarters after the battle." And Sherwood wrote that he went to Couch's headquarters after the battle, and Couch said, "I've seen the Army of the Potomac do a lot of charges, and what I've noticed is if they break contact with their elbow partner, the soldiers of their on either elbow, the attacks tend to stop." And he said, but today it was like every single soldier was an individual aggressor. He decided what route he wanted to take. He decided where he was going to attack, and he decided how he was going to attack. And Couch said, "I've never seen anything quite like it." And I think that's a pretty good evaluation of what the Western soldiers were like.